Can you see her? Man the cannons!
Black Flag Resynced is probably the most Assassin's Creed that the franchise has been since 2017's origins. While it's not the best game in the series, and while it doesn't surpass the original either, what it does accomplish is to be an earnest attempt at creating, or shall I say recreating, the charm, the subtlety, and well, the overall simplicity of the older AC games. And in that respect, Black Flag Resynced is easily the best AC game I've played in a long while. And that honestly shouldn't come as a surprise. After all, the original Black Flag was one of the best games in the series, featuring a protagonist that rivals the likes of Ezio as well as Altair. However, it's also the first game in the series that tried to stray a bit too far from the traditional Assassin's Creed identity. At its core, Black Flag has always been a pirate game that features a rather compelling Assassin's Creed story. Much like the Resident Evil 4 remake, I think a lot of players will eventually call Resynced a soulless crash grab. And don't get me wrong, I can understand those feelings, because after all, why would Ubisoft choose a game like Black Flag for a remake, when there are other games such as the original AC or Rogue that can benefit more from the remake treatment like this? Well, the answer is simple really, which is the broader appeal of Black Flag and its cultural impact on the series. However, at the same time, Resynced is far from a soulless remaster. There's a real sense of passion and love for the original game that I could feel while playing through it. It's a game made with a lot of care and thought put into every facet of its gameplay and story. Although it's not perfect, Resynced is a game that made me fall in love with Assassin's Creed once again. And what really impressed me here is the game's simplicity. It's not an RPG that wants to keep players playing for hundreds of hours. Instead, it's a game that delivers a quality open world, and honestly, after playing through games like Valhalla and Shadows, it genuinely feels liberating to not bother myself with yet another XP-driven open world Assassin's Creed. Resynced harkens back to the time when the franchise used to be a narrative-driven adventure first, and an insert story archetype fantasy later. And you know what? That's precisely the best aspect of this game. Now, before I get into the nitty-gritty of the gameplay, the story and everything in between, let's get the boring stuff out of the way first, which is gonna be performance. We played the pre-release build of the game, and while Ubisoft did release a day 1 update during the review period, most of our time was spent playing the unpatched version of Resynced. However, with how well the game was running already, I was honestly surprised it didn't include the day 1 update. Now, we only got access to the PC version of the game and we tested it out on 3 GPUs. RTX 4060, RTX 4070 and the RTX 3070 Ti. And all of these GPUs were running the game perfectly fine at 1080p and 1440p with high preset and ray tracing set to standard. This means we were using rasterized lighting for the most part, and only indoors and towns were using RTGI. On the 4060 and 4070, the performance was rock solid with only minor dips to the upper 50s during hectic naval combat sequences. On the now ancient 3070 Ti, however, there were some noticeable frame rate spikes, but it still played the game perfectly fine at a solid 60 FPS with DLSS set to quality. That being said, we did run into a handful of bugs during our time with the game, and this was with the day 1 update installed as well. There was one time during my playthrough where the frame rate suddenly dropped to the 30s and never recovered. I had to restart the game a few times just to get it back to normal. There were also some moments of stuttering that I faced when arriving at Havana. However, apart from these, the only bugs we faced were visual glitches like enemy corpses T-posing or just vanishing into thin air. We also had one quest blocking bug where an NPC did not appear during one of the Templar hunts. This forced us to restart the last checkpoint, resulting in the loss of a few minutes of gameplay. Other than these few things, Resynced is a very well optimized and polished offering from Ubisoft, which is shocking, I know. Now, coming to what's new in Resynced compared to the original. Well, there is a lot, but I don't think any of it is substantial enough. Let me explain. The biggest new addition, which has been the focal point of the game's early marketing, was the new officers. These are essentially new crew members that Edward can enlist for the Jackdaw, albeit with a bit more personality than the throwaway NPC. There are a total of 3 of these officers, and each of them comes with their own dedicated questline as well as gameplay perks. My initial thought was that the officers will have a more tangible impact on Edward's story and naval combat. However, that did not turn out to be the case. Once you unlock an officer, they are permanently situated on the Jackdaw, and they eventually give you access to their gameplay perks. There is no choice to be made on which officer you prefer over the other. Also, while each of the 3 officers does have a compelling backstory, their quests altogether aren't anything special. These quests feel very much like the ones we had in Valhalla and Shadows, with pockets of good character writing and a ton of filler dialogue. That being said, I did like Lucy Baldwin's quest, as it felt a lot like a Templar hunt, without the nuanced animation works of the original Templar hunt quests. And since we're talking about animations, let's address the elephant in the room, which is the motion captured cutscenes. One of the biggest concerns I've had with the recent Assassin's Creed games is the cutscene quality. In the older games, the cutscenes, even for side content, were always mocapped, which offered a sense of quality and prestige to these titles and their presentation. Hell, as someone who has been playing Assassin's Creed since Revelations, it was the cutscenes and storytelling in these games that made me a fan of the series. Even games like Unity, which were released as technical nightmares, had fully mocapped cutscenes that immediately immersed you in the stories, the world, as well as the characters. Unfortunately, that's something I cannot say about the mainline Assassin's Creed post-Odyssey. Even AC Mirage, which touted itself as the return to the roots Assassin's Creed experience, had cutscenes straight out of the depths of Valhalla. The robotic, stilted, and borderline ugly animations are the reasons I divorced myself from modern Assassin's Creed games. Thankfully, this isn't the case with Black Flag Resynced. Ubisoft Singapore left the original cutscenes untouched, and I'm honestly really thankful for that. All of the cutscenes from the original game are back in Resynced, and yes, that also includes the Templar hunts, with the only change being the lighting engine. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but it was the sheer quality of the cutscenes that kept me hooked to the main story of Black Flag, even though this is probably the 10th time I'm replaying the game. There are also a few cutscenes sprinkled throughout the main story, such as the one you get pretty early on after leaving Havana. And I was honestly surprised that these new story animations were fully mocapped. That being said, there are also a few fair robotic cutscenes as well, especially in the officer quests. Fortunately, these are few and far between and don't really affect the game's immersion factor. Apart from these cutscenes, another new addition to Resynced is the endgame. In the original Black Flag, after completing the main story, the only activities worth doing were the legendary ships and maybe the Mayan steel for the Izu outfit. However, with Resynced, the endgame, as they say, has been expanded. There are a few more legendary ships for you to hunt, new forts to capture, as well as new contracts to tackle that should give you ample reason to return to the game for just a few more hours after you have already rolled the credits. The collectibles obviously do make a return as well, and are relatively unchanged from their original format. If you have been liking our review so far, then do help us out with a like and subscribe. Your support means more than you think, and it lets us dive into more content like this. With all that said, the biggest change in Black Flag Resynced is the combat system, for better or for worse. In the original Black Flag, the combat was on rails akin to the Batman Arkham games. It wasn't anything complex, but if it's one thing that the older Kenway Saga combat excelled at, it was making you feel like a truly badass assassin. This is something we lost with the series pivoting to a more RPG-like combat. With Mirage, Ubisoft did try to course correct, but it was still far from the glory days of older AC games. And now with Resynced, I think they are finally getting close to the older combat system. Now don't get me wrong, I'm still not fully sold on the combat in Resynced. It feels clunky and even unresponsive at times, which aren't the terms I'd use for the original's combat. However, at the same time, I also think the combat in Resynced is probably the best iteration of the hitbox-based system. Much like Mirage, we don't get access to multiple weapon archetypes here. Instead, you're given access to just your dual swords and a pistol. The complexity in the combat system comes from the counterplay options, which are the dodges and parries. If you time your parries perfectly, you can immediately break an enemy's stance, opening them up for a critical attack, which is just a basic ARPG affair. However, at the same time, some enemies cannot be parried unless you're using special trinkets, and to take them down, you need to fire your pistol and then perform a finisher. It's not a very complicated system, but I don't think the franchise needs super complicated combat mechanics to begin with. Now that being said, I do have my fair share of gripes with the gameplay in Resynced. Firstly, the parry and dodge animations are not always reliable. There have been times where Edward outright refuses to parry an attack even when I'm mashing LB as aggressively as humanly possible. Also, much like the recent RPG AC games, the combat in Resynced is clearly designed with the one target at a time philosophy, and as a result, it immediately falls apart once you're surrounded by multiple targets. And unfortunately, you're frequently asked to go up against multiple enemies at once, especially when boarding enemy vessels. But that being said, there's still the multi-takedown system in Resynced that functions mostly similar to the original. It's essentially the only viable option that helps against bigger skirmishes. However, in my experience, the multi-takedown mechanic here isn't as fluid and intuitive as it was in the original. In fact, most of the time when I was boarding the enemy ship, I didn't even get the chance to perform multi-takedowns due to how cluttered everything got with Edward's crew joining the fight. And to deal with the clunkiness of the combat, I ended up relying on the age-old technique of smoke bombing. So I just dropped a smoke bomb in the middle of a group and just blindly pressed triangle to see the magic happen. Now, while I'm somewhat mixed on Resynced's assassin part of the gameplay, I'm completely sold on naval combat and the improvements and additions made to it. A quick refresher for those who might not be familiar with the developers of Resynced, who are Ubisoft Singapore. The studio was a support developer for the original Black Flag game and mostly helped polish the ship combat mechanics. The studio ended up enjoying the ship combat so much that they pitched and started working on an expansion for Black Flag that was simply focused on the naval aspect of the game. This expansion eventually ballooned into a full-fledged standalone game, and in Ubisoft's own words, the world's first quadruple A game. And no, I'm not talking about Just Dance's Pirates of the Caribbean DLC here. Instead, I'm talking about Skull and Bones. Now, I won't blame you if you have completely forgotten about the game, even I did for a while. And while not a bad game per se, Skull and Bones wasn't anything special. And surprisingly, even after the quadruple A status, it didn't really feel like an upgrade to the naval combat and exploration systems we had in Black Flag and Rogue. With that in mind, I did have my reservations with Black Flag Resynced's naval combat sections, knowing the history of the studio in charge of developing it. However, I'm honestly pleasantly surprised with the naval combat in Resynced. Not only did Ubisoft Singapore manage to retain the essence of the original game's naval systems, but they also made some really impactful and meaningful changes to it. And as much as I love the original Black Flag, I do have to give it to Resynced for offering what is easily the best ship combat in any video game to date. Period. For the most part, the naval system in Resynced is left unchanged, and so is the progression around it. You get your ship, i.e. the Jackdaw, in Sequence 3. Plundering gets you raw materials which you use for the Jackdaw's upgrades, making it more viable against even bigger brigs, frigates, and ultimately the man of war roaming the West Indies. There's a certain charm to being a pirate, exploring the vast stretches of the ocean, plundering vessels as you please, and going about doing pirate things. And Black Flag Resynced understands this and delivers just that. Now, as for the new elements, the biggest features are ammunition types and quick switches. Essentially, the heavy rounds now have an alternate option, which are the flaming rounds. The flaming rounds don't have the range of the heavy shots, but they do pack a mighty punch, and also are incredibly effective at creating weak points. Also, you get access to upgrades like mortar and puckle gun pretty early in Sequence 4. And it might just be me, but I do think that the speed of combat while piloting the Jackdaw is ever so slightly increased in Resynced, and I feel this is for the better. I mean, a good chunk of my 40 hours of playtime was spent exclusively on naval exploration and combat, and for good reason. The naval combat is just that good. If you were a fan of the original's naval system, then trust me, you're going to have the time of your life with Resynced. However, if you didn't click with the naval warfare in the original, I do firmly believe the improvements made in Resynced can change your mind. Even outside combat, the naval exploration in Resynced is as great as it was back in the original, if not more. There were times during my playthrough where I stopped doing the quest or collectible hunting just to go out and explore the vast stretches of the Indian Ocean. Not in search of prizes and booty, but just for the sheer joy of exploring. You know, there are times in life where you just want to forget what you're doing and what you're working towards, your goals, your ambitions, the deadlines or whatnot, and just immerse yourself in the moment. Enjoy it, savor it, maybe go out on a drive without any predetermined destination. Yeah, so Black Flag for me often felt like that. Despite the number of things I planned to do, be it to collect the mine steel or clear out the plantations or hunt the 15 humpback whales to craft the pouch upgrade, I often found myself lost in the moment, just exploring the waters, listening to shanties and watching the time fly by. All in all, the naval stuff in Resynced is as good as I remembered back in the original Black Flag. And if you were worried after Skull and Bones that Ubisoft might fumble, well, this should assuage any doubts you might have had. Now, coming to the other major highlight of Assassin's Creed Black Flag, the story. Well, what can I say about it, to be honest? It's Black Flag as we all know and remembered, with just a new coat of paint. I'm genuinely thankful that Ubisoft didn't try to reimagine the entire story and left it as it is. Every addition made to the story is superficial at best and can be easily ignored should you choose to do so. The core of the original story, characters and scenarios are left untouched, which is possibly for the best. As much as I love the Ezio trilogy, I do think the writing in those games does show its age. I mean, just boot up AC2 for instance and go through the first couple of sequences. Compared to that, Black Flag has a much more mature narrative, something I think should have been the norm for modern AC games. It's a story about a reckless privateer turned pirate who starts as any other money-hungry scoundrel but eventually becomes an inspiration. And guess what? Unlike most modern character tropes, Edward's growth isn't speed-tracked. Instead, the story eventually builds up to it. I won't go into any spoilers, as even though Black Flag is more than a decade old, it's still a story that should be experienced firsthand and not in a review. It's a pirate story that's less Pirates of the Caribbean and more the Iron Giant. With that said, I do have one major complaint with the story, that being the modern day or lack thereof. It's no secret that Ubisoft has been dropping the ball when it comes to modern day aspects of Assassin's Creed since 2014's AC Unity. It's something that the studios don't clearly prioritize over the immersive historical segments. And as much as it pains me, I do think minimizing the modern is the right call, since not even Ubisoft's writers can keep track of the jumbled web of storylines across games, comics, novels and more. However, what irks me is the sorry excuse of modern day elements that are added in Resynced. Same as AC Shadows, the modern day in Resynced is basically a walking section with some elementary grade puzzles thrown in for good measure. It doesn't add anything to the experience outside of confusing the player and just wasting their time. At least in the original Black Flag, the modern day segment had a purpose to them. For example, the revelation that the sage is connected to Juno. But in Resynced, we don't get the original modern day sequence. Instead, there's this dark animus thing that's been hinted at, all the way back from AC Shadows, which I don't feel to be all that entertaining. The only silver lining here is that the modern day in Resynced is completely optional, and honestly, I would just recommend skipping it. Lastly, I would mention that yes, Black Flag Resynced does have microtransactions for cosmetics and in-game resources. Although the store was online during the review period, it did not feature the pricing of the cosmetics on offer. And yes, all of it is optional and frankly completely uncalled for in what is otherwise a very good single-player experience. Thankfully, none of the microtransactions affects the game's main story or progression, which sort of helped me ignore it for the most part. You're still going to be bombarded with the store's offerings when you boot up the game, which certainly isn't ideal. But hey, at least there are no XP boosts this time around. Overall, Assassin's Creed Black Flag Resynced ended up being way more enjoyable than I anticipated. With Ubisoft's recent track record, it's very easy to dismiss their games as open-world shovelware. However, it's in rare moments like this that Ubisoft ends up surprising its fanbase. Be it with roguelike gems such as Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, or the remake of one of the most beloved titles in the Assassin's Creed series. Which is why we are giving Black Flag Resynced an 8.5 out of 10. With that being said, the remake is clearly a game made for fans of the original. As such, I don't think it's going to appeal to anyone who isn't already a fan of the original Black Flag or even the Assassin's Creed IP as a whole. At the end of the day, it's still an open world game complete with collectibles, map markers, and a fair share of amazing side content. If you aren't a fan of Ubisoft's cookie cutter open world formula, I don't think Resynced is going to change your mind. However, if you are one of those jaded fans of the series like me, who got disenfranchised with Assassin's Creed with its pivot to a more RPG focused structure, I do think you're really gonna enjoy Black Flag Resynced.